Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we can have great conversations, learn about fun tech, and meet some great people along the way. I got my coffee, and I'm ready to have a great conversation with my guest today. And I'm super excited because this guest, they do some things that are very, very similar to me. They got some streams, they got some side hustles, they work at a really, really fun company, and I'm super excited. My guest today is Brian Douglas. Brian, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Hey, crew, and Isaac, thank you very much for having me on. Also,
Awesome.
That's a very large coffee.
Yeah, I could probably not drink that much coffee, I guess. It's one of those things where I drink one coffee during the day, and I slowly, I don't drink this all before, 10. It's not one of those things where it's you'll get time-lapse of the entire stream, and, Isaac's coffee goes from full to zero. That would be kind of a cool meme, but I'd probably be, super shaky by the end of it. Thank you again for being on. This is super, super fun for me because, some of the stuff that you're doing, I'm always, I've started following you, I want to say 6 months ago. Somebody recommended you to me, and I was like, oh, this guy's got some really, really cool stuff. He's got some cool open source projects. He's got, some podcast things. So my first question for people that are very busy like you, when do you have the time to do a lot of the stuff that you're doing?
That is a great question. Honestly, I don't do a lot of. So I used to do a lot of open source on the weekends, do a lot of side projects on the weekends. I honestly don't do much on the weekend either. I attempt to try to be very present and be with the family because I got two small kids. So I find a time during the working hours. So what I usually do is I scale everything. If you want to book a meeting with me, I have a Calendly link. You click it, it looks at my calendar. We can have a meeting. And I just make sure that everything is sort of orchestrates around my Google Calendar because that's what I use day to day and what I drive with. So if I block out time for this morning, I woke up early, was editing videos for work. I knew if I did not, because a lot of times I have regular meetings during the day.
Yep.
So I have a block from 8, usually it's 7:30 to 8:30. I'll just do nothing but editing videos because I need to sort of have my brain focus on that. For coding, every Friday morning, I'm doing open source and contributing, and sometimes I'm doing it on stream as well.
Yeah.
So this calendar.
Yeah. So it's fun learning about different calendar hacks. There's an app that I have. So I drive everything's I do is on Windows, and there's an app I think it's called Outlook Gmail Sync or something like that. But basically every day I click a button and it syncs my Google Calendar and my Outwork calendar. And the way that I am able to sync things from my work, not all of my meetings from my work calendar, is I have a category. So that's what I do, and then I have a magic mirror downstairs, which basically just has a calendar on it, and my wife can see oh, whatever. And then I also do some dumb stuff with lights and stuff to change the color of lights and things like that. But it's one of those things too, especially working from home now, working remote, always around the family. Keeping everybody on the same page is super, super important because. You mentioned you have some kids. The worst thing ever is when the kids just barge in and they're like, "Hi, how are you?" And you're like, "I'm kind of working." And I try to have all of my meetings on camera just because I feel more tuned in. Because if I have my camera off, I'm probably off doing other stuff. And most of the meetings that I have, if I'm not paying attention, I'm probably missing something. So it's just one of those things, right? I think also what's really, really interesting about some of the stuff that you do, you have all these open source projects, but you also work, you don't work at some random small company that doesn't do much. You're able to just carve out a lot of time. You work at a company like GitHub, right? So, what is the work that you do at GitHub, and how are you able to balance the work that you're doing there, which is obviously open source type stuff, to the Brian personal initiatives that he wants to do in the same space?
Yeah, and that's a good question too as well. So to summarize my work, I'm a developer advocate at GitHub.
Sure.
I work on the developer relations team. I joke that I'm the Beyonce advocate, and it's really because we have so many users. I think the number is 65 million users on GitHub. So that's developers, designers, product managers, all across the board. And I get to basically showcase how to leverage GitHub to the masses. So GitHub Actions comes up a lot in the work I do. I teach people how to automate their workflow, how to basically take what they don't want to do, automate that so they can get to what they want to do, which is essentially write code. So if you want your test to run whenever you push up to a pull request, we could do that. If you want to automate your stand-ups, so instead of having a meeting, like my team, we have an issue that opens up once a week, and we add all of our stuff for working there inside the issue. So it
Interesting.
actually automates to close the issue on Friday. On Sunday mornings, because we have a team member in Australia, it will open up an issue on Sunday morning, and we just like clockwork, we just add stuff there. And then what's nice about that is like our agendas for like our when we do actually sync and talk,
Yeah.
like it's all in the issue. So we're always constantly updating that. So that's what I do in a nutshell. But I already forgot your first question, but like
That's
the
fine.
work that I balancing the what I do outside of work and what I do in work. This is something that it's not it's not possible for everybody. It's also could be not well like for wellness.
Sure.
Probably not don't do this, but
Yeah.
a lot of what I do for GitHub blends into what I do outside of GitHub.
Yeah.
And like my personality is blended into GitHub as well, and
Yeah.
like the work that I do. Mainly because I've always been interested in open source. I've always wanted to be a part of it. I've never had this sort of forethought to like build a product or a project or a library and open source it. But I love leveraging those things. I love contributing to those things, answering questions, being part of that community. And that's exactly what I do at GitHub. I am contributing open source on the clock,
Yeah.
like all day, every day. Whenever I see something that needs a little fix, actually, I have an issue that I'm going to open up another project that it's a tab that's open, but I'll be adding an issue to a project because I was working on my own project, saw there was a bug in a project I was using, and I'll just open up issue, have that conversation, and hopefully we can have that merge sometime before the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, end of the day, that's pretty agile. That's impressive.
Well, I mean, I kind of know the solution,
Yeah.
but
Of
I always
course.
take I always open the issue first
Yep.
because I don't want to be that person of like, hey, I have a fix for this.
Random pull
I want to
request. Yeah.
actually, yeah. I love this alerting folks, like using the features that are available to you. Alert the folks that, hey, there's a bug. Here's the problem. Would you like me to fix it? This is the line that I would change. So I try to give as much information up front. And it's the same thing I do as a maintainer of projects. I try to give enough information up front too as well. So if you see the good first issue tag on any of my issues, it's like legitimately
Yeah.
has the issue laid out, documentation links, and also the solution. I
Yeah.
try to give the solution in the good first
So
issues
you're
as well.
so you're basically spending more time like building the first issue concept than actually just fixing it, right? Like that's something
Yeah.
that personally I am very bad at. Like there's been times where I'm like, oh, I found something that I did like it's a small little nit or like an edge case, and I'll just fix it. Like there's a great example
Yeah.
of like being more open to collaboration, where it's like living with the issue, knowing how to fix it, right, and having the time
Yeah.
to fix it to some extent. Like I think that's that's a really impressive thing. You know, you mentioned GitHub Actions, which I think is funny because I'm a huge proponent of GitHub Actions. I talk about them a lot, and I've noticed you mentioned that you kind of hop around, and I see your name as like the last person to commit. I've seen it like 3 times on different GitHub Actions, and I'm like, oh, I mean, this guy, he's all over the place with GitHub Actions. That's awesome. I mean, we can talk about GitHub Actions all day. I think they're super super fun, and I think it's one of those things where people have an opportunity, like you said, to automate things that they wouldn't rather do. I mean, like
Yeah.
I tell people that I do this talk on GitHub Actions, and I've done it a few times, and the first question is like, well, it's just like CI/CD, right? Like there's other tools for that. I'm like, no, it's not just CI/CD. It's like literally
Yeah.
anything. Like you don't even have to have it tied to doing actual code things, right? Like you mentioned, just doing stuff for issues or doing stuff for pull requests or external webhooks or whatever, right? I mean, super super awesome.
Yeah, and I love talking about the outside the CI like interactions with GitHub Actions because I think CI is a good way for most. I wouldn't say most developers. I don't want to pigeonhole anybody who might be junior and might not be aware, but like CI running tests is something that a lot of folks focus on because it's a nice little introduction to
Most definitely.
integrating with GitHub. And I just had a course actually that shipped last week from Leveled Up tutorials on how to automate your code using GitHub integrations. That's including actions and the API and webhooks, whatever you choose your flavor. But a lot of my examples were like open up an issue, have a comment run. Open up an issue, add this label. Like Also, you could actually during Hacktoberfest, the one action I built was called Take Action.
Mm-hmm.
During Hacktoberfest, I get a lot of people who just are interested in contributing.
Yeah.
And I have a small project, so like I don't. This is not a normal
Yeah.
occurrence.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if I know that I'll be the blocker of like assigning folks to issues, I created the action to basically assign folks to issues. Basically, just that.
Yeah, I'm always very when I talk to people about GitHub Actions and they've been using them for a while. I always like, what's the funnest thing they should do with the GitHub Action? I know that GitHub had like a contest. I think it was last year sometime. Maybe it was a part of Hacktoberfest but it was like, show us like your most interesting GitHub action. Like CI/CD is great, but like what are some other things that you can do with it? And like I do a lot of like, for instance, whenever I blog, like I have a GitHub action that kicks off, like it tweets it puts it on Reddit, it puts it on LinkedIn for me. Like I have stuff like that. I also do like a lot of shadow copying. Like that's something that like, so for people that don't know, I work at Microsoft. And I own a couple of large projects that we have public versions of that repo and private versions of that repo where we can experiment. And we do this thing where if somebody opens up an issue on the public one, we can move all of that content over to the private one in a meaningful way. So like, that's using the GitHub CLI and the different webhooks that are available through GitHub. And it's super, super impactful and exciting. I think one thing that's also really, really cool is, one of the things that you talk about a lot, from what you were just saying is, are you still there, Brian? Brian is no longer there. Oh no. I don't know when he disappeared. Hold on, everybody. Trying to get Brian back. Please hold, everybody. I am trying to get Brian back. So Brian just had a computer shut off. So I think this is a great opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the stuff Brian's doing. He will be back in a second, but I think one of the things that I think he would love for us to talk about is he's the host of something called Jamstack Radio. I'm gonna go ahead and put that in the chat. But basically, it's just a podcast about some modern things. I think, I've listened to a couple of episodes. He talks about things that are, not just GitHub related, but things that are just open source and just technology related. So I think that's a super interesting thing for folks to check out. One thing is also as well that I think folks would take advantage of. So for Brian's pretty active on Twitter. I'm going to put that into the chat as well. So give me 1 second while I pull those things up. All right. So that's the link to his radio show, the podcast that I mentioned. I think one thing that's also really, really important to call out too is, one of the things that I think is very, very important about open source is, this idea of contribution. And when not just contributing as like a main maintainer of a project, but also contributing as, somebody coming new to a project and wanting to play around with it. And we're gonna talk with Brian about that in a second. But it's one of those things that I think is really, really important for us as developers to think about. Again, super, super exciting stuff. We're gonna be back in just a second. Thank you everybody for your patience for tuning in here. One of the fun things too that I've been working with recently is, so I kind of do stuff at Microsoft for our events. So like right now, Microsoft Build, which is coming up at the end of the month, we're doing all sorts of fun stuff there. So I'm really, really excited to share some of that stuff out later in the next couple of weeks. I'm really, really excited for some of the stuff that we've done. I think we're going to have some really, really interesting conversations between now and then, just as it pertains to what the cool things that Microsoft's doing, cool things that GitHub's doing, because GitHub has an event coming out soon as well. Yeah, let's see where Brian is. Give me 1 minute. All right. Well, they always tell you that you're not supposed to have dead air when you do these things. So I think one of the things that we could definitely talk about as well is one of the things we're talking about a little bit with Brian about like GitHub Actions, right? It might be valuable to just talk a little bit about what GitHub Actions are, just at a high level. So like GitHub Actions they're workflows that you can put and hook into your GitHub repository that allow you to do different things. Like we mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the things that people think about a lot is this concept of continuous integration, continuous delivery, right? So like DevOps things. So for instance, getting your code built, your code tested, and your code deployed out to wherever it is. But there's also some really, really interesting stuff too that you can do with it. Like you can, like Brian was mentioning, you can trigger off of GitHub issues or GitHub pull requests, different webhooks in that space. Brian's hopping back on, so give me 1 second to get that set up for him. Hey, Brian, how are you? All right, give me 1 second to bring you back on. People can't see you though, but that's fine. You got your camera up?
Yes, I should have it up.
All we see is the beautiful team sign. But that's cool. So I mean, while you're figuring that out, we can talk a little bit. We were talking about. There you are. There you are. But you're really. But you're really.
Had to turn it off and turn it back on.
No worries. You're a little small, so let me fix that. Oh man, this has been all sorts of fun, Brian, already.
Yes, technology.
Yeah, I know, right? It's all good though.
Yeah.
So we were kind of having that first conversation. We were talking about GitHub Actions, the different stuff that you can do, right? I think one thing that's really, really important to call out, as we kind of move away from that conversation, is you can do, pretty interesting stuff with GitHub Actions that have nothing to do with CI/CD, right? So like these concepts of, whether it be automations to different things or hooking them up to different, whether the third-party webhooks or GitHub webhooks, right? Super, super cool stuff.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm not sure at what point I cut off, but I mentioned Hacktoberfest, and that I created an action to assign anybody to take an issue, and that worked super, super well for me that month. Because I was not the blocker. I didn't have to be up 24 hours during the day to inbound people who wanted to triage issues and take the issues. So everybody was sort of empowered to take the issue and sign themselves an issue and go work on it.
Yeah, no, I mean that's super awesome, and I know that GitHub did, they had a contest, I want to say at some point last year, right, where it's like, show us your coolest GitHub action, right, or the coolest workflows that you do. I mean, that's fun things too, like just showcasing things you can do outside of just typical DevOps stuff, right? One of the things that I'm always curious to know with folks too is how you got started in tech, right? So maybe not like an origin story of how you got started in tech, but maybe when you first came across open source or the concept of software available somewhere that you can use and modify to your needs. Do you remember a particular example of that first happening for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've plenty of early examples of trying to manipulate MySpace and looking at people's codes and leveraging SourceForge to steal other plugins, or not even plugins, like little scripts. But my earliest actual contribution to open source was when I was trying to build this thing which would auto invite folks to Slack.
Yeah.
Now Slack is it's similar to Teams, and it's really meant for teams. So a lot of the features are built with the idea of organizations and teams and paid features. And there was one thing that I wanted to do, which was every time I introduced the Slack to somebody, it was a Slack for people of color to talk about tech. And I just wanted them to add themselves to the Slack. I didn't want to have to be, again, the gate of trying to find their email, add their email, get them in the Slack. So I created a node script. I tried creating a node script to auto invite folks whenever they entered a type form, and then auto invite them into the Slack. I found the solution on GitHub of someone who built this as an npm package, and it worked.
Oh, cool.
And but the only problem is I didn't know how to use like the latest node, which was at the time was like probably like node 6.
Okay.
Maybe it was pretty old. Maybe even earlier than that. But it was at the time where Node split from IOJS to Node.js, and IOJS was like trying to do cutting edge ES modules and all the ES Next types of features, and Node.js was sort of slowly trying to make certain things were backwards compatible. And I started writing JavaScript like professionally at that time, so I didn't know any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, I reached out to a guy. The maintainer of the project, he got back to me and was like, "Oh, yeah, this is what you need to do." It was like a one-line fix, Harmony flag, and it got to work. I contributed back to the documentation, and that was like my first contribution to open source.
That's awesome. That's a great story. So it was one of those things where you had already been working, right? At that point, you'd already been kind of working in technology, and you came across it. It wasn't one of those things where maybe you were in school and you came across, you mentioned MySpace, right? Like I don't know how old you are, but I grew up in that time where like it was kind of like a badge of honor if you could like break people's browsers with your MySpace pages, right? Like with all the terrible CSS, all the terrible JavaScript, and like you go to a MySpace page and it was just disgusting, like flying animations and music playing, and it's just like trying to find the exit button the close button as fast as possible, right? I think that was like the last frontier of like terrible web design being like kind of fun, right? I think after that people were like, no, like let's never do these sort of things ever again, right? Plus it was a great example of like people who probably didn't know how to use some of the tech, like just finding snippets online and pasting them into their pages and stuff like that too, right? But yeah, like that's a great example. Like MySpace pages is open source. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, and it's the thing that comes to mind too as well. It's like the Web 2.0 era is definitely where I sort of really cut my teeth in. It's like the WordPress and all the other things that were happening around the mid 2000s. It brought in so many other people who just wanted to tinker. Maybe you didn't want to build your own servers from scratch or develop your own command line interface games, but it brought more people in the fold. And I think that's what I love about companies like GitHub, tools that in libraries you could find on GitHub, is that a lot of the problems that we were all struggling with in the past are solved. Yeah. And now we can go solve other interesting problems as well. Like the thing that I'm fascinated with is like TikTok as a platform.
Sure.
TikTok being like the sort of short form video stuff. And what I love about that is that like they just make video editing approachable. Yeah. Sort of approachable. I think there are a lot of Gen Z folks who are like,
I don't know how approachable it is for me, but I mean, I totally agree. I love TikTok. Like developer TikTok is super fun too. I'm always and I have this conversation with people a lot. Like I'm not very artistic. I don't have a lot of creative ability. So like whenever I see people that can do things like whether it's Adobe Premiere or Photoshop or TikTok, like quick video editing, like I always just get irrationally mad. Because it's like, I know that if I was to do that same thing, it would take me like 6 months, and it takes you like 15 minutes. I mean, it's one of those things too where people probably feel the same way about writing code, right? Like, there's no way that I could go from like here to there writing code. Like to the effect that I tried.
But that's the beauty of it,
exactly.
though.
Go ahead.
Because it's the beauty of it is that like I can go find an npm package that connects the Teams API to my project. So if I want to embed Teams, and I mentioned Teams because that's what we're using right here to interface and talk to each other, that I can embed that into my website. So if I want all my Teams call to be promoted or public, or if I want to make it easier for folks to find the link, and perhaps they don't use email as active, like I'll create a nice little form that gives you a Teams link, and you can integrate with that. And that's what I love about this is that like TikTok has now made editing approachable for Gen Z folks. Code NPM is making code approachable to folks who perhaps are just graduating a boot camp or finishing their second year of a CS program. Like now everything's not everything, but a lot of stuff is available. Like I can do machine learning, like create data models over the course of a weekend. And that was the thing that would take like months and years to figure out.
Yeah, I think like the rapid nature, I wonder what caused, is it the, and this is maybe just a bit of a rant, but like my generation, like the millennial generation, are people that they grew up having access to all this information. So the expectation is like all the information must be available right now. It must be easily accessible, or I get very upset, right? Like, because it, like,
Yeah.
you know, we cut our teeth, like you said, like this, you know, technology innovation, like right around the early 2000s, right? And every now and then I think, like, is it the people that came up in that time frame? They're like, they want to continually push to innovate, push to make things more accessible, or is it just the technology is so easy that it's allowed people to be able to do that? That's the thing that I always like to think about. Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both too as well. Because I think like if all you ever knew was Nginx servers and like doing your own thing, and like you didn't realize that there are other tools like Azure and DigitalOcean that make this easy for you, then you're going to always build your own thing.
Yeah.
Like I used to work for this company called Netlify, and Netlify made it easy to get static deployed sites up and running.
Sure.
And at the time when we approached that, everybody was really focused on, you know, getting your own, you know, servers up. And it was the server, like the accessibility to actually get your servers running and not have boxes in your kitchen or under your desk. It kind of changed the game for so many different things. But then what blew everything out of the water is the fact that not only can you do that, but also you could deploy every time you push to GitHub. Because now you're thinking about like, I don't have to have a box under my desk. Like nothing, my house is not heating up because I'm running like, you know, this dashboard or this game form. Now I can do so much more because now I have access to the internet, to the processes, to infrastructure that I normally would never have access to. And you see like countries like India, you see countries like Brazil, who have usually in the like in our minds, like us being part of the US or the Western world, like we don't really focus a lot of our time and attention when we develop features and products and stuff like that. But now they're developing features and products that are competing with what we're building, which now you see the democratization of information now being in full force, where if I create a video on YouTube, someone responds back and says, well, you didn't address this thing. Here's a link to the documentation, or here's a link to my fix. Like the information is constantly streaming through, and it's like constantly, you know, one-upping each other.
That's a good thing to call out too, is that even if you have like a little thing that you think a lot of people might not be paying attention to, like just by economies of scale, like there's billions of people with potential access to your stuff, right? Like at some point in time, you'll have one or two comments. That's just math, right? Like even like the lowest percentage points, right? And that's always like very fascinating to me, especially with a place like GitHub. You mentioned earlier, 65 plus million developers. The chances of you just interacting with 5 to 10, that's like a statistical just blip, right? That's like, but it means something to you as an individual. But like in the grand scheme of things, like it's less than like 0.01%, right? Like that's something that's really interesting.
Yeah, what's interesting about that too is what I brought up TikTok already. But the opportunity to become viral on TikTok and grow a big audience it's really it reminds me of the days. So I'm probably pretty close to your age, but back in the MySpace stage, it was a very similar experience where if you just tried a little, like you could actually have a band, or you could have your thing blow up on MySpace. Like we have Adele, we have Taylor Swift, we've got so many other like small bands and that are huge now. Like Owl City is another one I was familiar with in college. They grew a huge following, and now they're like a multi-record deal artist now because of MySpace. We're going to see the same thing with TikTok. So apply that to code. You have the same thing where now you see all these large projects that used to be small that are now part of Foundation, sponsored by Microsoft, that are doing really big things. But what's concerning or interesting is the fact that sometimes you might look at stars or you might look at forks and interactions as a metric to say, okay, well, this project's doing really well, I'm going to use this project. And there are other projects that are smaller, that are up and coming, that need that extra attention. So like, I guess we didn't bring it up, but like that's what my hope is with product like open source project like open source, is I want to be able to take that sort of like, yes, there's going to be a really good way to check out the trending page or changelog nightly, to find out the new projects. But also, what about the up and coming projects? What about the projects that my coworker or someone I follow on GitHub is interested in? How do I find those projects? And that's what I'm hopefully trying to accomplish with my side project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I just want to say one thing, right? So I think we're the same age, but like I remember, so this probably dates me, but like the Roots came to my college to play, right? And like not everybody knew who the Roots was at that point. And I remember like, this is great because actually thinking back, I'm like, how did I get the opportunity to see the Roots like at some small college in Washington State, right? Like now they're this enormous band, right? The Tonight Show and all that stuff. But it's one of those things where like they were a bit famous before MySpace, but like they definitely took like the entire technology innovation and capitalized on it heavily, right? It's one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
It's very, very interesting, like how technology, even like whether you started like in that time or a little bit before, but you were just smart enough to get that it was not going anywhere, right? Taking advantage of that. And I think that one of the things that you mentioned about open source that's really, really cool is, making it just like you mentioned, keep on mentioning like barriers or gates, like making sure that those are, easy to jump over or easy to open if they're there, and making it so people can contribute in a way that's really, really meaningful, right? Like that's something that I love to talk about. So, what was your initial concept when you were thinking about open source, and like now it's become something that, people know about and all that great stuff. So, talk a little bit about that origin story.
Yeah. So it's a bit about my origin story of open source.
Sure.
Like I didn't know where to start, where to begin with Node.js and what was happening there. And there was like a lot of institutional knowledge, people who just happened to follow the newsletters or write newsletters that knew what was happening. So like coming in pretty fresh to JavaScript at that point, or server-side JavaScript at that point, I needed a lot of information. Yeah. So I built open source to originally stalk open source projects.
Sure.
Like I wanted to find out, who is the maintainer that I should talk to? Like what are issues that are open, and like when can I like grab them? How can I filter issues for unassigned? Like honestly, these are all features you could probably leverage GitHub to do. Mm-hmm. Actually, 100% use GitHub to do, but GitHub's a power tool.
Yep.
And a lot of people use their power tools in the way that works for them.
Yep.
So not knowing that you can filter by unassigned is something that I wanted to sort of kind of massage my developer workflow into eventually learning, and then share that with other people eventually. So today, open source, you sign up, you can add projects, and then you can like follow issues. We have a feature that will be merged into filter by good first issues, and then you can take notes on those projects. So like if you found a really weird nuanced thing of how to set up the development environment, take note about that, open up an issue, open up a PR to fix the documentation.
Yeah.
And like a real concrete experience is I went to contribute to Graphical, which is the interface to consume GraphQL APIs. That project was going through a huge undertaking and change because the recently founded GraphQL Foundation.
Oh, cool.
Started getting funding. So they were actually just rewriting tons of stuff. But as an outsider, you didn't see any of that conversation because it's all happening on Discord. Mm-hmm. So eventually I went to do a contribution there, found out how to fix a bug. And the maintainer responded back to me and was like, oh, well, thanks for your contribution. Like I guess they don't really get a lot of those.
Yeah.
And they were like, hey, we have a whole conversation in Discord. This is a valid bug because we're going to rewrite this entire part of the app.
Oh,
and I was like, oh, that's good to know. So then they basically invited me into the Discord, and now there's a whole world. It's almost like I don't know, like the movie Hook, where they eventually one day they find out all the food is imaginary and whatnot, and like in your mind is like once you understand that there's a whole other world that everybody's operating in, then you're like, oh, this makes sense. Now I can fly.
Yeah. No, wow. That's first off, congratulations on that Hook pull. Like that was in context. I'm always very impressed when people are able to just pull pop culture out of nowhere that completely like meets the exact context of what we're talking about. That's a great example, right? And for all we know, like you made like your example of like having like that process of getting access, right? Like super gated experience, right? And it's about bringing down like this idea of that. And you mentioned somebody who you don't. And let me ask you this: do you see yourself as like an open source contributor, or or like somebody who's very active as a contributor, or do you see yourself as a more of a facilitator with open source?
Yeah, that is a good question. I definitely feel more of the
Yeah.
facilitator slash advocate role,
Yeah.
just generally in open source, because I get a lot of folks who reach out to me as like, oh, I found open source. Like, how would I even approach
Yep.
this? And then people contributing to open source get this sort of hand holding to eventually contribute to other
Yeah.
projects. So I see a lot of people come through open source, they contribute, and then they move on to other projects.
Sure.
Perhaps projects they're more focused on, like maybe some bots or some other stuff in the language that they would like to write code in. So like I tend to do a lot more facilitating and sort of leaving breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
I put a tweet up on the open source Twitter just recently about open sauce.pizza is a TLD.
Yep.
So there's a TikTok where someone's cutting a pizza and they just keep cutting it into like smaller and smaller slices. And I joke that that's active. That's what it looks like for an open source maintainer to create good first issues.
Yeah.
And it's really about this, like you find this one little slither that you want to hand to somebody that you could probably eat yourself or consume yourself. But you're going to leave that out there for someone else to sort of take it. And like, once they complete that one easy issue, you're like, oh, cool. You want another one? And it's like, that one was so small, I could eat 2 more.
Yep.
So then you close 2 more issues, and then eventually it's like, hey, I got this feature. Do you want to like take a crack at it? And then you entice them to eventually.
Yeah.
So it's like, I've been doing a lot of like figuring out the sales aspect of open source, which is a scary word to say out loud.
Yeah.
But it's not really selling. It's more of like hospitality. That's a better term.
Interesting. Okay.
How do you like with hotels? Like you walk in, I mentioned this on Scott Hazelman's podcast, but you walk into a hotel room, like you have expectations. Like here's where the bedding is.
Yep.
Here's where the extra blankets are. Here are the little soaps.
Sure.
Here's like, the hard soap, the liquid soap, the shampoo, like all that stuff exists in the project. So like, I just make sure all the soaps are in the right place in my project.
Interesting.
And then I try to influence other projects to do the same thing. So that's the other half of open source, is actually convincing maintainers to check all these boxes in their repo.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the goal, and to be completely fair, it might not be everybody's goal when they create an open source project for them to be the most easily accessible to contributors, right? Like that's the thing too. I've talked with people on stream and off stream that they have an idea and they just want to get their idea out, and they don't really need the collaboration. They don't feel like they're going to grow from that contribution collaboration cycle, right? But they just have an idea and they want to get it out there so maybe people can fork it or whatever, right? But they don't really need the coming back to them. And I'm always very interested, like you're mentioning, like the other side where people coming to you is like, I need just help just being better at open source, right? Like I feel like there's almost like there's a value in like an open source 101. It's like not tools at all, right? Like, you know how we talk about DevOps as a principle, or instead of like tools based things, right? Like I'm always like, that might be something that I wonder what the interest would be of like, maybe a 1 hour, whether it be a talk or a series of talks about like, this is what is required to have that mindset of being ready for collaboration and contribution with the work that you do. Because I don't know about you, when you were working at other companies or even when you're working here at GitHub, but like a lot of the stuff you do is very compartmentalized, and it's very like, what is Brian working on? At least with me, there's like not tons of collaboration across like teammates or teams. Like you do that, but like there's projects that you own that you have to kind of manage and first to end, right? And it's one of those things where open source isn't like that, because people come in along the way and they provide insights. So I wonder, for people that are getting started, whether they're new to tech or they're new to the concept of open source, like how much value there is in that like 101 experience, right?
Yeah, and it's like the age-old thing of like you pair with another engineer on the team, and you see that one thing. It's like, what was that extension in your VS Code, or what was that command you just ran? All right, let me see your bash alias. And that's kind of how you sort of absorb all this knowledge. So like, again, like my introduction to contributing to that Node project was, I just didn't have all that knowledge of like what was happening, how to approach Harmony flags and next level features. And it just would have took another member of my team to tell me that. But not everybody has a team that's large. A lot of folks, they work in small orgs that maybe they're the only developer, and maybe they're in the marketing org that they manage the site, and they don't have a lot of good at bats or a lot of takes that could take to go try something new. So, and I love that about open source is that perhaps like you're writing a lot of JavaScript, but you're like, you know what, I would love to write Go, but it's on. I can't shoehorn it into the work I'm doing today. So how can I learn Go and have practical experience? Well, if you find a cool Go project, like go build a project with that, go contribute to that community through either documentation. And I highly recommend documentation first as your first introduction to open source. Like if you can make it easier for someone else to find it and to use it, going to be the best contribution by far. It's going to be the longest lasting.
I say this, I pound the table like every time, right? If you don't want or you don't feel comfortable, that's a better way, contributing to like software, right? Maybe you don't have the time commitment. Maybe you don't feel like you have the necessary skills. Maybe there's some imposter syndrome there. Like I've said this a million times, every maintainer will take people to write docs for them. Every single maintainer. Like I've talked to lots of maintainers and I've never met one who's like, nah, we don't really need anybody to write docs. Because I mean, like the secret is that developers hate writing docs, right? So it's not even really a secret. But I think your point is really spot on about how we can, like, not incentivize, but like empower or influence people to want to contribute to things. Because there is this concept of like people just come in and out of open source. Like maybe they use an npm package that uses like 70,000 other npm packages because that's how npm packages work, right? And they don't know, and they probably don't need to know, like all of the underlying things. But like if something's broken, it might be very beneficial for you to understand like why it's broken, right? If you enjoy the sausage getting made thing, which I do, because people take a huge risk with open source. Because you're like, especially when you're doing it for your job, like if you're bringing in an open source project like an npm package or a Docker container or something, right? Like you're very dependent on the work that you're doing for a paycheck. That's dependent on potentially some person who like spends 6 hours a month, writing code on this side project, right? Like you become very dependent on the work of others where it's not their primary, source of income.
Yeah, no, this is very true. And like to be able to, and there's also another notion too as well, like not every open source project wants contributions. Not every open source project is meant to be the next, large npm package or whatever. Like I think there's another part of the hospitality as well, and just understanding that like, what are you why are you putting this on GitHub? Like, is it to get contribution? Like if that's the case, then like these are steps that you could do to make contributions happen or contributors show up. If it's to get funded, then there's other things that you could probably do to also add in, or maybe just not less add in, but also more reaching out and maybe doing surveys or whatnot and get people engaged. But there's like, I guess it's a two-sided coin. Like the maintainers, they need to have an idea of what they're trying to accomplish with having this project out in the open. And a lot of times what happens is like maintainers don't really have this organized, which is also fine. But then one day, I was chatting with the maintainer of Webpack, and I was chatting with them and asking like, what was the thing that made Webpack sort of explode? And a lot of people don't remember this, but it was actually React, a whole nother project. There was the Pete Hunt, who was he was on the Instagram team, and they were building an Instagram site, like Instagram.com, because it was originally a mobile app. And they found React React was an internal solution that they built at Facebook. But in order to sort of take things that they were trying to do next level of like the virtual DOM, as well as like JSX for manipulating your component, they found Webpack to do that. And at the moment that Pete Hunt mentioned, I think at JSConf, mentioned Webpack as the solution to their problems, Webpack took off.
Oh yeah.
And it took off in a sense of like adoption, not took off in the sense of contributors. So they got, it's like almost the equivalent of being on the front page of Hacker News.
Like
now you have all these people using it.
The hug of death, right?
Yeah. And it's like, what happens is your project actually gets users? Like did you plan for having documentation? Did you plan for actually having clear releases? Did you plan for having contributor guidelines? And usually the answer is no. It's like, I built this thing, it solved a problem, now people are using it, and we'll figure it out as we go along, which is totally fine. But knowing that as a contributor is like, oh, now this project's popular. It doesn't meet my criteria to use this at work because it's missing docs, it's missing release notes, it's missing this. I can help this project because I know how to do that. Or maybe you don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe you can learn it and then like institute that knowledge somewhere else.
It's so funny that you bring up Webpack, because I think about Webpack a lot as somebody that, I cut my teeth like with AngularJS. Like that was like the first like JavaScript framework that I actually like paid attention to. There was Knockout and there was all these other ones before it, but I think AngularJS is the one that for whatever reason, like I think it was just because my employer was like, we should use AngularJS. I'm like, okay, I'll learn AngularJS. And I remember like with Webpack, like getting everything started with Webpack, and I remember like realizing very quickly that this is a very, very powerful tool, like to your thing earlier, right? And like sometimes like if you just have like a screw, like a little screw that's like this big, like do you need like an industrial power tool? And I think what we've seen now is like an attempt to obfuscate the complexity of the power tool, right? It's like now all the CLIs, like the React CLI, the Angular CLI, like they all use Webpack underneath the covers, right? Like to an extent. And it's one of those things where it's like you still know that Webpack is there, but you don't care about Webpack anymore because you have some easier tool on top of it, right? So like, what are your thoughts about that, where it's like, tools being obfuscated by other tools for ease of use, right? Because these are all things that are open source, right? Like, is there value for, and I'm not trying to bash Webpack, but is there still value in learning Webpack when most of the primary JavaScript frameworks have like a Webpack wrapper, like whether it be AngularJS and CLI and all that,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call myself the king in analogies, but I think it'd go to like, if you look at your car, like I assume maybe you have a car, or the listeners have a car, like, is it still worth it to know how to change your own oil?
Sure.
And I could change my own oil. I did it years ago when I first got my first car. But then I realized really quickly, I like keeping my hands clean. I don't want to get my keyboard dirty. So there is value in learning how to change your oil and oil. But also, it's a wash. Like the investment in time is probably going to cost you a little bit more than going to my quick lube down on the corner.
Yep.
So with Webpack, I think it's the same thing. It's like eventually we've built enough Webpack plugins to now build frameworks. And those frameworks now dependent on Webpack plugins. So now we're a little further removed from the core metal of Webpack. And I use the term metal as a concept. It's not really, there's no metal there. But what I'm getting at is like, I now have enough, like I have a framework of when I use a Webpack build of what I use, because I know I want a progressive web app. I want to use a React app. I want to use some JSX, maybe some Babel. It all just works. So like, I no longer, actually, it's been quite a few years since I opened up a Webpack config.
That's my point. That's my point, right? I mean, and it's not a bad thing. I think because our friend Sean Grove _IO says, I cannot change my car's oil, so no Webpack for me, it sounds like. But I think one of the things that's very, very important to call out is there are levels of interest as technologists, right? Like some people really, really enjoy that. Like you mentioned earlier about no longer having like a server in your house that like heats up and drives up your energy. I have media server in my house, right, to serve stuff. And that's because Isaac likes to play around with stuff and tinker and all that sort of jazz. Other technologists are like, just give me some solution and I'll use it. And maybe when I'm not done with that, when I don't need that solution anymore, maybe I'll just move on to the next thing. But I still value like the need to get complex when needed, because there are cases where you can't use just some obfuscated tool. Like you can't use the CLI and JSON, or you can't to manage Webpack. Like you need Webpack. Otherwise, Webpack wouldn't exist anymore. Like it would just be consumed by these other things, and like the repo would have the no longer maintained sticker on it. Like other tools in that space, right? Like you saw, like Bower years ago, right? Like Bower quickly realized, hey, there's a lot of other tools in this space. We don't think we provide a ton of value anymore, so like we're gonna move on to better things. And like that, I remember when that first happened, like Visual Studio, like templates still used Bower and all these other things, and people were like, oh, that's not good. But the industry changed and we moved on to something else, and now it's fine. But I remember like that was a huge catalyst, right? Because a lot of people are very dependent on something like that. So like when a maintainer decides like I can't can't put my heart into this anymore. Maybe that's a bit romantic, but like I can't invest in this anymore because I don't see the value it brings. And there's still a lot of customers that use it. Like that's a very earth moving thing, especially with something like Bower, because that's an example I always think about. It's like, man, how many projects had to be updated the second that they decide to flag the repo, right?
Yeah, and it luckily, like Bower, you had a contingent, like a migration path.
Yep.
I think most people moved to npm
Yep.
from there. But like even with Webpack, there is a like there's new tools like ES build. Actually, yeah, ES build. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. Bundler built in with Go.
Yep.
And then like even with Babel, like we have a new Rust one that just sort of showed up in the trending page. That like there are new next level versions that are using languages that are supposed to be faster, and like ESBuild seems like it's taking off at the moment. But there'll always be an undo thing. And I think what it comes down to is like eventually, like we started this conversation with talking about MySpace.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
I'm going to basically say we're both not using MySpace anymore. We figured out how to be social on the internet eventually.
Yeah.
And like Facebook's still around. Like maybe Facebook one day shuts down Facebook and everybody moves to Instagram. And that's like the new Facebook, perhaps. Everybody wants a cleaner experience. But you know, I could spend a lot of time trying to figure out my contingency plan on what my Facebook account is supposed to look like in 5 years from now. Or I could just build really cool things and have a really cool social engagement. But yeah, I think eventually one day we might not be using Webpack, maybe Webpack Micro or pre-Webpack or whatever we want to call it. There will be, or post-Webpack, there will be a new version that everybody migrates to and has a cleaner interface and it's faster and performant. And it's going to look great on our Tesla screens for sure.
Oh, man. Let's not talk about the Tesla screens. So one thing that so I will call something out, and I'm sorry if this is anything other than what I mean it to be, but like you are different than a lot of people in that sense, right? Like you're okay with some cheese moving or some change because you understand the technology needs to adapt, right? There are a lot of people out there, myself to some extent, where it's like I don't really like change. Like don't change my stuff, please. I don't really want that. But I've learned to embrace because I love technology so much that, 2 years ago, I wasn't working on the same stuff I'm working on now, right? Like 2 years ago, like we were very dependent on different tools, different ideas, different concepts, what have you. And, I see all this innovation happening by all these big companies, right? Like I'm not going to like just talk great about Microsoft here, but like VS Code, and Docker, Kubernetes, Go, all these great implementations of completely open source solutions, right? Like, and I think GitHub being a really great example of that. I think GitHub recently, like in the last 6 months, like now their roadmap for all their tools is now like out in the open. Like the roadmap is really cool. Like I think companies now, like big companies, are starting to realize like it's very important to let your customers know what's coming, because then it's not jarring. Like I remember, I don't know how much you were in the like event space like 4 or 5 years ago before a lot of these tools came out, right? Where you would see the news from an event, or you'd be in an event and there'd be some huge announce and everybody gets super, super excited because they've never seen it before. Like that's not really a big thing anymore. And we talk about that all the time internally at Microsoft, where it's like you can't really talk about the cool stuff coming out with .NET because literally you can go and see like the latest commit from yesterday or today, right? Yeah. Same thing with like all the JavaScript frameworks, like they're all open. So it's like, how do big companies, like how do they still continue to captivate with innovation when all the innovation's out in the open?
Yeah, and I was laughing because I remember React 17, 0.17 shipping, and it said like no new features, just bug fixes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I remember the reaction to that, which is like, honestly, if it's agile development, like it's what we all were pushing for, Scrum and everything like that. We want to be able to ship something, and then if it doesn't work, revert it back. And hopefully you don't have to revert it back. And I joke about the reverting back because Kanye, his what was the Life of Pablo album when he shipped it like 4 or 5 years ago? he actually edited it after it was shipped. So like
Oh,
all the songs were different.
Yeah. Like,
So he was like practicing agile development on his his album.
I think that was just an opportunity to sell more records for Kanye, but that's just a personal opinion of Kanye. But like it still harkens back to this thing where it's like the what version of Angular shipped yesterday meme, right? Where it's like it seems like Angular is like Angular version 45 now. Like there was Angular JS and then it slowly kind of creeped up, and then once it hit like Angular 4, Angular 5, it seems like they're shipping a new version of Angular like every week. And I mean that's great. And now React does a very great job too. Vue, like the upgrade process is so easy for these tools now. Like you just run a command and it updates your projects, right? So you even if you are
that's the future.
Yeah, like even if you are super agile, like you still have to do some updates. So like if framework of choice or repo of choice like makes the process super easy for you, like one of the things at Microsoft that we do is like the .NET migration assistant, where you can upgrade from .NET framework to .NET 5. Like that is a painful process for a lot of people, and it's one of those things where if Microsoft or any other company that built framework that changes, like they don't provide an easy path. It introduces an opportunity to lose a customer. And I'm glad that open source has kind of opened this this I don't want to call it's a weakness in technology, but when things change. And making that change as lightweight as possible for people is super impactful. I mean, it's really, really exciting. We're about out of time, and Brian, I want to thank you so much for hopping on and chatting with me. We had some technical issues, but I think we graciously handled it. I think that was great. The conversation that, especially with you, it's funny, I realized you mentioned that you have a colleague in Australia, and I just totally forgot that Michelle is on your team, right? And we've interviewed Michelle.
Yeah.
And that was a great, and it just shows you that the people that work at GitHub are super fun to talk to. That's what I've decided. I talk with enough people at GitHub. The people at GitHub are fun to talk to. But that has nothing to do with GitHub. That's to do with you as a person and Michelle. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for hopping on here and chatting. When we sign off with our guests, one of the things that we love to do is, if you can think of technology or open source in one word, what would that word mean to you?
Open source, empowering.
I
think that's
awesome.
Would be my word. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. We don't need to talk about empowering. It's pretty self-explanatory. So for the folks that are checking out the stream and maybe they don't know some of the stuff you're doing, I've put some of the links like Open Sauce and your podcast in here. But maybe how can people easily get a hold of you?
Yeah, Twitter. BWO on Twitter is probably the easiest way. My DM's open, and I tend to respond to most of them depending on. If I'm going viral at the moment, I might have DMs turned off. But if I'm not viral,
how's that experience, right? Like when you go viral, how does that feel?
Yeah. I mean, it only happened only twice, I think, in my
cool,
10 years on Twitter.
That's cool, though.
But it makes it hard because a lot of people reach out about GitHub features and issues through my mentions. Almost impossible to respond to anything when people are commenting on my last TikTok.
Yeah, I know a couple of people that I don't want to say they go viral a lot, but they get every now and then. I'll be sitting next to them and they'll have Twitter open. I'll look at their phone. This is obviously before COVID when I could actually sit next to people. Their Twitter would have 99 plus notifications in their notifications. I'm like, bro, turn that off. That just looks painful to me because at least for me, I'm so dependent on people's positive feedback for me that I would feel like I need to respond or every single notification, which is not scalable when you're famous. So hopefully I never get famous because my wife will be like, you're liking too many things on Twitter. I can't be with you anymore. I mean,
well, I'll let you know when I get there.
Yeah. No, so follow BWO on Twitter. He's also on GitHub, obviously. I think, you'll see him floating around in the GitHub Actions space because he does all sorts of fun stuff. But, check out the podcast of his, check out Open Sauce. And again, Brian, thank you so much for hopping on, and it was great chatting with you.
Excellent. A pleasure.
Take care, everybody.